The world was gone. Elina stood at the edge of the observation deck, her violet-hued eyes unblinking as she gazed at the swirling debris field that had once been her home. Virilia was nothing more than drifting dust, a scattered ruin spinning in the cold void of space. The remnants of a civilization, of a culture, of her people, gone. Her slender fingers tightened around the metal railing. The station's artificial gravity made it unnecessary, but still, she held on, as if letting go would pull her into the abyss along with everything else. She had survived, though she did not know why. When the human rescue fleet had arrived, she had been floating in the wreckage of an escape pod, barely conscious, her mind already drowning in the unbearable weight of loss. It was a miracle she was still breathing, a miracle she had never asked for. Elina? The voice was gentle, hesitant, a human voice. She didn't turn immediately. She knew who it was, Eric Carter, the human pilot who had pulled her from the wreckage, who had spoken softly to her in those first disoriented hours aboard the rescue vessel. Over the past weeks on Station Helios 4, he had become the only presence in her life that wasn't filled with echoes of grief. Still, she did not answer. Eric exhaled and stepped closer. I know you don't like talking, but I just wanted to check on you. A pause. It's been 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The words felt meaningless. Time had lost all shape since Virilia's destruction. Her life had been measured in colors, in brushstrokes, in the delicate etching of form upon canvas. Now, there was only black. Eric shifted uncomfortably. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face that always seemed to carry the weight of unspoken thoughts. His uniform, standard issue for Terran fleet pilots, was rumpled, as if he had been too preoccupied to care about regulations. He rubbed the back of his neck. I brought you something. That made her turn. He held out a small, battered sketchbook. Elina frowned. What is this? A gift. Eric hesitated. You told me once that Virilians don't use digital tools for art. Something about the soul being lost in the process? She stared at the book, at the worn leather binding, the faint scent of old paper wafting up. It was imperfect, flawed, so very human. Eric smiled, just a little. I thought you might want to try drawing again. Elina's fingers twitched. Her mind recoiled at the thought. How could she create when her world was dead? How could she paint when every color reminded her of something lost? And yet, her hand moved before she could stop herself. She took the sketchbook. It was warm from his touch. Days passed, maybe weeks. Elina spent most of her time in the observation wing of Station Helios 4, her sketchbook resting on her lap, untouched. The station was a cold, sterile thing. White corridors, humming lights, the occasional passing of humans going about their lives. It was not a place meant for Virilians. It was not a place meant for artists. She should have left. She could have requested transport to one of the Virilian refugee enclaves forming in distant systems. But the thought of being among the few scattered survivors, of hearing the whispers of grief and broken futures, it was unbearable. So she remained. Eric came often, not always with words, but with presence. He had a habit of sitting near her without expectation, as if understanding that silence was the only language she could bear. Sometimes, he would bring her things, fragments of Terran history, old photographs, physical books instead of holophiles. She never asked for them, but she never refused. One evening, he found her staring at a blank page. You ever gonna use that thing? Elina's fingers traced the edge of the paper. I don't know how. Eric frowned. What do you mean? You're an artist. I was an artist, she corrected. Eric studied her, then leaned back in his chair. You know, humans have this idea that art isn't just about skill. It's about emotion. Sometimes the best art comes from pain. Elina's gaze darkened. Then I should be the greatest artist in the universe. Silence stretched between them. Then, Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metal cylinder. He pressed a button, and a tiny hologram flickered to life. It was a painting, a Virilian piece, shimmering with iridescent blues and deep purples, a depiction of a city that no longer existed. One of yours? He asked. Elina swallowed. Yes. Eric tilted his head. It's beautiful, but I don't think beauty dies just because the artist is in pain. She looked at him then, really looked at him. Humans were strange. They had lost worlds before. Earth itself had nearly been rendered uninhabitable during the resource wars, but they endured. They rebuilt. Virilians did not rebuild. They remembered. And yet, her fingers twitched again. Slowly, hesitantly, she picked up a pencil, and she began to draw. The first sketches were hesitant, fragments of memories, half-formed shapes that bled from her mind onto the page. At first, it hurt. Every line felt like reopening a wound, every shade a reminder of something gone. But she did not stop. Eric noticed the change before she did. "You're drawing again," he said one evening, his voice careful, as if afraid to break whatever fragile thing had awakened in her. Elina did not respond. She was sketching the station's observation window, the endless void beyond it. But she was not just drawing the stars. She was adding color where there was none, weaving Virilian light into the darkness. Eric leaned closer, studying the image. "It's different." She frowned. "How?" "It's not just the past anymore." His gaze met hers. "You're drawing something new." Something new. The thought unsettled her. She had only ever recreated, remembered. But Eric was right. There was something else in these sketches now, something unbidden. A future, perhaps, where there had once been only echoes. She did not know what to make of that. And then, softly, Eric asked, "Would you ever paint again?" Elina hesitated, and for the first time since Virilia's destruction, she did not say no. Elina stood in the art bay, staring at the blank canvas before her. The station's storage units had yielded what she needed, traditional Virilian pigments, carefully preserved in sealed containers. It was a small miracle, another gift from Eric, who had somehow convinced the station quartermaster to relinquish them. She ran her fingers over the paint vials. Deep blue, like the skies over Virilia's capital. Radiant violet, like the bioluminescent flowers that had once bloomed in the gardens of her childhood. Gold, rich and warm, like the twin suns that no longer burned. The sight of them filled her with a quiet kind of terror. She had always believed that an artist's soul lived in their creations. But her soul had been shattered. What could she possibly create with these colors when everything they represented was gone? Behind her, Eric watched in silence. Finally, he said, "You don't have to do this." Elina turned. "Then why bring me the paints?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Because I wanted you to have the choice." Choice. It was such a simple word, and yet it struck something deep within her. The destruction of Virilia had taken everything. Her home, her people, her future. She had not been given a choice when the planet burned. She had only survived. But this was different. She reached for the brush. The first stroke was hesitant, barely more than a whisper of color against the canvas. But as the second followed, and then the third, something shifted. The brush moved with memory, with instinct, with something deeper than thought. Gold spilled across the canvas, forming the curve of a rising sun. Blue stretched outward, deep and endless. Virilia's skyline took shape, not as it had been in its final moments, but as it had once been, in its prime, in its beauty. Eric exhaled softly. "It's incredible." Elina didn't answer. For the first time in weeks, she was lost in creation, and the weight of loss did not feel so suffocating. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was not entirely lost either. Eric did not understand art. Not really. He had spent most of his life in the cockpit of a ship, navigating the vastness of space, dodging asteroid fields and enemy fire. His world had been one of motion, not stillness. He had never questioned that. And yet, somehow, he found himself coming back to the art bay every day, just to watch Elina paint. At first, she barely acknowledged him. But over time, something shifted. She began speaking. Small things, nothing grand. She would mutter about a color not behaving as it should, or about how human canvases lacked the luminescence of Virilian ones. Eric listened. He didn't know why he kept coming back. Maybe it was because he had never seen someone fight against their own grief so fiercely. Maybe it was because, in some strange way, he felt responsible for her survival. Or maybe it was something else entirely. One evening, as Elina worked, he asked, "Do Virelians believe in second lives?" She paused mid-stroke, then tilted her head. "You mean reincarnation?" "Yeah." She considered this. "Not in the way humans do. We don't believe a soul returns in another body, but we do believe that creation is a form of rebirth." Eric frowned. "How so?" She gestured at the painting before her. "Virelia is dead. And yet, in this moment, it exists again. Not as it was, but as something new. Something born from memory and loss." He looked at her, then at the canvas, at the city of light taking shape under her hands. For the first time, he thought he understood. The news came unexpectedly. A Virelian enclave on the colony world of Theres, 9 had reached out, offering Elina a place among them. It was the first real sign of a future since the destruction of her homeworld. The message arrived via a station-wide transmission. Elina read it in silence. Eric stood nearby, arms crossed. "So, are you going?" She did not answer immediately. Theres, 9 was a chance to be among her own kind again. A chance to rebuild, to be part of something larger than herself. It was the logical choice. And yet, her eyes drifted to the painting still in progress. To the colors she had thought she would never use again. To the human who had refused to let her disappear into her grief. Finally, she said, "I don't know." Eric's expression flickered. Something unreadable, something almost hesitant. Then he nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it." Elina studied him. Humans were strange creatures. Resilient, stubborn, endlessly unpredictable. She wondered what it would mean to stay. And, for the first time, she realized she was considering it. Days passed, and the weight of the decision pressed against her. Theres, 9 was safety. It was familiarity. It was the past, carried forward. But staying on Station Helios, 4, that was something else entirely. One evening, as she stood at the observation deck, Eric found her again. He did not speak immediately, but the question hung in the air between them. Elina turned to him. "Would you miss me if I left?" Eric's jaw tightened. He looked away, then back at her. "Yeah," he admitted. "I would." Something in her chest tightened. Elina had thought she had lost everything. But here, in the quiet corridors of this human station, she had found something unexpected. Not a replacement for what was gone. Not a return to the past. But something new. And for the first time since her world had burned, she was willing to embrace it. She looked out at the stars one last time, then turned back to Eric. And she made her choice. Elina had always thought of decisions as colors. The past was deep indigo, a shade that clung to her like twilight, refusing to fade. Grief was black, heavy and consuming. And the future, she had never assigned it a color before. Perhaps because she had never thought she would have one. But now, standing before Eric in the quiet corridor of Station Helios, 4, she realized that the future was something else entirely. Something undefined, waiting to be painted. And for the first time, she had a choice in what that painting would become. "I'm staying." Eric blinked. "You are?" The moment stretched between them, filled with the hum of the station's artificial systems. Elina met his gaze. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a breath that sounded somewhere between relief and disbelief. "I thought for sure you'd go." "So did I." He hesitated. "Why?" She had asked herself that question more times than she could count. There was no single answer. But as she looked at him, this human who had refused to let her disappear into silence, who had given her back her art, who had shown her that creation did not have to be tied to the past, she found the truth in the space between words. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, "but I want to find out." Eric's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Well, guess we'll figure it out together." Life on the station settled into something strange yet familiar. Elina continued painting. At first, only in the solitude of the art bay. But as the days passed, she found herself venturing beyond, bringing her sketches to the common areas, allowing curious humans to watch as she worked. At first, they were hesitant. Station personnel were not accustomed to Virelian customs, and art was not something typically seen in a place built for function rather than beauty. But curiosity was a universal trait, and soon enough, people began gathering whenever she painted. Even Commander Harlow, the station's no-nonsense administrator, took notice. "This isn't a gallery," she had said the first time she passed by. Elina had expected resistance. But then, after a pause, Harlow had added, "But I suppose it makes the place feel less empty." And that, Elina realized, was the point. Virilia was gone. But the colors that had defined it, the essence of what had made it home, that could still exist. Not as memory, but as something new, something shared. One day, a young human engineer approached her hesitantly. "Could you teach me?" Elina raised an eyebrow. "You want to learn Virilian painting?" He nodded. "I never knew much about your people, but I think maybe this is a way to understand." She had not expected that, but as she looked at the eager expression on his face, she thought of how Eric had given her a sketchbook when she could not find the strength to create. Perhaps it was time she passed that gift forward. Eric found her later in the mess hall, sitting at a corner table with her sketchbook open. He slid into the seat across from her without asking, a habit she had long since stopped protesting. "So," he said, "I hear you've got students now." Elina gave him a wry glance. "One student hardly makes me a teacher. Give it time. Word spreads fast." He smirked. "Might end up running the first art school on a Terran station." She snorted. "Unlikely." Eric leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. "Hey, stranger things have happened. You're here, aren't you?" Elina looked down at her sketchbook. Yes, she was here. On a human station, surrounded by people who had no reason to care about Virilia, yet somehow did. Learning to exist in a world she had never imagined being part of. A world that, little by little, was becoming hers. Her gaze flickered up to Eric. She had not forgotten what he had said before. "We'll figure it out together." She was beginning to think she wanted to know exactly what that meant. Weeks passed. Elina's presence had become an unspoken part of station life. People stopped by the art bay to see her work, engineers asked about Virilian aesthetics, and even the station's medical staff had started using her paintings to decorate their sterile, gray walls. It was a strange, quiet kind of belonging. And then, one evening, Eric appeared at her door with a different kind of proposition. "You ever been to Earth?" Elina blinked. "No. Want to?" She hesitated. Earth was not Virilia. It was not home. But then again, nowhere was, not anymore. And perhaps, just perhaps, that meant she could choose where to go next. She studied Eric's expression. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not fully understand. She thought of colors again. The past was indigo. Grief was black. And the future? Perhaps, just perhaps, it was the color of possibility. Elina closed her sketchbook. "When do we leave?" The descent into Earth's atmosphere was unlike anything Elina had experienced before. She had seen planets from orbit, their colors swirling in the void. She had watched the fiery glow of 1,000 sunsets from the observation windows of Station Helios 4. But this was different. This was falling. The shuttle trembled as it pierced the thickening air, the heat shielding flaring bright against the friction of re-entry. Outside the viewport, clouds rushed past in a blur of white and gray, breaking apart to reveal the vast sprawl of blue and green below. Earth. A world still alive. A world still whole. Elina tightened her grip on the armrests. She had spent months convincing herself that she belonged somewhere. On the station, in the quiet spaces between lost things. But this was new, unfamiliar. She turned to Eric, who sat beside her in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls. He caught her gaze and grinned. "Don't worry, I've done this 100 times." "That doesn't mean I trust your piloting," she muttered. Eric chuckled. "Fair enough." The turbulence lessened as they broke through the lower atmosphere, revealing the landscape below. Rolling green fields, winding rivers, clusters of shining cities. It was unlike Virilia in every possible way. No bioluminescent structures, no floating spires of crystalline architecture. The colors here were softer, organic, grounded. Earth was old, and yet it had endured. The shuttle banked toward a sprawling coastal city. "Welcome to New San Francisco," Eric announced. "You're about to experience the best damn food in the galaxy." Elina arched an eyebrow. You mean the only food in the galaxy still made from organic animals? Hey, Eric said, feigning offense. Real meat is a luxury, okay? Lab-grown stuff doesn't have the same soul. She shook her head but said nothing. Humans and their strange attachments to food. The shuttle touched down smoothly on a private landing pad overlooking the bay. As the engines powered down, Eric turned to her, his expression suddenly more serious. You ready for this? Elina hesitated. She had stepped onto space stations, into refugee centers, into the ruins of what was left of her people. And yet, somehow, stepping onto Earth, his world, felt different. But wasn't that the point? She took a breath and nodded. I'm ready. The first thing Elina noticed about Earth was the smell. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, salt from the ocean, something warm and rich from the street vendors lining the walkways, the faint metallic tang of nearby hovercraft. And people. So many people. Humans bustled through the streets, moving with a kind of chaotic energy she had never quite understood. Laughter, shouting, the hum of machinery. It was overwhelming and alive all at once. Elina pulled the hood of her cloak up over her head, shielding her more alien features from view. Though humans had long since accepted interspecies relations, Virilians were rare. The less attention she attracted, the better. Eric walked beside her, his pace casual, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. So, what do you think? Alina's gaze swept over the towering buildings, the endless movement of life. It's loud. He laughed. Yeah, it is. You get used to it. How did you grow up in this? With a lot of earplugs. She smirked despite herself. They moved through the city, Eric leading her toward a quieter district lined with art galleries and studios. It was strange, seeing human interpretations of beauty, their sculptures and paintings so different from what she had known. And yet, something in them resonated. They entered a small studio space, the walls lined with unfinished works, canvases half-painted, sculptures mid-carved. The air smelled of oil paints and something distinctly human. Coffee, perhaps. Eric motioned around the room. This used to belong to a friend of mine. She moved off-world last year, but she never sold the place. He turned to her. It's yours, if you want it. Elina froze. You're giving me a studio? Eric shrugged. You need a place to work. And Earth could use a little Virilian artistry. She stared at him. He had done so much. Rescued her. Given her a reason to create again. Brought her here. She did not know what to say. So instead, she stepped forward, running her fingers over the empty canvas before her. Perhaps this world was not hers. But maybe, just maybe, she could paint a place for herself here. Days passed, then weeks. Elina settled into a rhythm. She painted during the day, capturing Earth's colors in ways she had never expected. The deep green of forests, the ever-changing hues of the ocean, the golden glow of the human sun. At night, she and Eric wandered the city. He introduced her to human foods, laughing at her cautious expressions as she tasted strange flavors. He took her to music halls, to hollow theaters, to places where humans danced with reckless abandon. And somewhere in the space between those days and nights, she realized something. She was no longer just existing. She was living. One evening, as she worked on a new piece, Eric leaned against the doorway, watching her. You know, he said, I've never actually asked what you're painting. Elina hesitated, her brush pausing over the canvas. She was painting them. Not in the way humans depicted faces, not in the way Virilians captured memory, but in colors, in feeling. Eric was gold, the warmth of a sun she had never known, the steady presence that had guided her from the edge of oblivion. And she was something new. She looked at him, meeting his gaze. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I think I'm still painting it. Eric smiled, stepping closer. Then I guess I'll have to stick around to see how it turns out. She didn't answer. But this time, she did not look away. One night, as they stood on the rooftop overlooking the ocean, Eric broke the silence. You ever think about the future? Elina considered the question. She had spent so long trapped in the past, in the ruins of what had been. But here, on this human world, surrounded by new colors, new experiences, new possibilities. She finally saw something different. I do now, she said. Eric turned to her, his expression unreadable. And does that future include me? The answer had once been uncertain, but now she saw it clearly, painted in colors she had never dared to use before. She stepped closer. Yes. And as the city lights flickered around them, as the stars above stretched into infinity, Elina realized. For the first time since Virelia's destruction, she was home. Elina had always believed that an artist captured the soul of a world. And yet, as she stood in her studio on Earth, she realized she was no longer just capturing the world. She was becoming part of it. Her paintings no longer depicted only Virelia. They held new colors now, the deep blues of Terran oceans, the warm reds of sunlit streets, the amber glow of human city lights at dusk. But the piece that sat before her now, unfinished, was different. It was him. Eric had left early that morning, off on some errand he refused to explain, which usually meant he was planning something ridiculous. In his absence, she had found herself painting. Not from memory, not from duty, but from feeling. She had painted the golden warmth of his presence, the quiet steadiness of his voice, the way his laughter had become a sound she associated with belonging. It was not a portrait in any traditional sense, but anyone who knew him would recognize it. The thought unsettled her. She had painted many things in her life, but never someone she had not been willing to lose. The realization sent a shiver through her. A soft chime echoed through the studio, her comm device flashing with an incoming message. Eric, come outside. Trust me, she sighed, setting the brush down. He was always up to something. Elina stepped outside into the cool night air, pulling her cloak around her shoulders. Eric was waiting just outside the building, leaning against the side of a sleek hovercraft, his arms crossed, his grin far too smug for her liking. She eyed him warily. What have you done? Nothing yet. He gestured to the hovercraft. Get in. She folded her arms. You realize that is not an answer. His grin widened. Come on, Elina. Just trust me. She stared at him for a long moment. The last time she had trusted a human, she had been pulled from the wreckage of her world. The thought should have made her hesitate, but instead, she found herself stepping forward, climbing into the craft without another word. Eric slid into the pilot's seat beside her, hands moving over the controls with practiced ease. The engines hummed to life, and within moments, they were rising into the sky, the city shrinking below them. Elina glanced at him. Are you going to tell me where we're going, or? You'll see, she sighed, shaking her head, but said nothing more. The craft cut through the night air, leaving the city behind. Lights blurred beneath them, stretching into open land, then the deep darkness of the ocean, and then they rose above the clouds. Elina inhaled sharply. The sky unfolded around them, vast and endless, the stars stretching in every direction. Below, the clouds glowed faintly with reflected city light, an ocean of silver mist. Eric glanced at her, his voice quieter now. I figured you might miss the view from orbit. She turned to him, startled. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed forward, hands steady on the controls, as if he had simply wanted to give her this moment, expecting nothing in return. Something in her chest tightened. Eric, she said softly. He glanced at her then, his expression open, unguarded. And for the first time, she saw what had been building between them. Not just friendship, not just understanding. Something more. Something unspoken. Something waiting. She did not look away. She did not run. Instead, she reached out, just slightly, just enough. And Eric, ever steady, reached back. The ride back to the city was quiet. Not awkward, not uncertain, just quiet. Eric didn't press. He never did. But Elina could feel the shift between them, as subtle as a change in brushstrokes, as inevitable as the blending of colors that were never meant to be separate. When they landed outside her studio, she hesitated before stepping out. Eric turned to her. You okay? She exhaled, studying him. You surprise me, she admitted. His brow lifted slightly. Good surprise or bad surprise? She considered. Good, she finally said. His grin was softer this time. Glad to hear it. She lingered for another moment, then turned to go. But before she could step inside, his voice stopped her. Elina. She turned back. Eric looked at her. Really looked at her. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, "You don't have to say anything now, but just tell me if I'm wrong." She did not need to ask what he meant. Her heart was a canvas half-painted, a work unfinished. And yet, she stepped forward, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like a gulf, but a choice. "You're not wrong," she said. And then, before she could lose her nerve, she leaned in. Just enough, just barely. And Eric closed the distance. It was not rushed, not desperate, just right. Like a final brushstroke completing a masterpiece. Like the moment when colors ceased to be separate and instead became something new. Something beautiful. The kiss had been brief, soft, unhurried, yet it had changed something. Elina could feel it in the way Eric looked at her now, in the way his presence carried a quiet certainty. She had spent so long believing she had lost everything. That grief was the only language left to her. That art was merely a way to remember, not to move forward. But now, standing in the doorway of her studio with Eric beside her, she realized something. She did not have to paint the past anymore. She could paint the future. She reached for his hand without thinking. "Come inside." He blinked, clearly surprised, but followed. The studio was dimly lit, the faint glow of city lights filtering through the tall windows. Her unfinished painting still sat on the easel, the abstract representation of him. The warmth, the steadiness, the golden hues she had never used before. Eric walked toward it, tilting his head as he studied the brushstrokes. "Is this you?" she admitted. He exhaled a quiet laugh. "Damn, I look good in color." Elina rolled her eyes. "Don't make me regret painting you." He smirked, but his gaze softened as he turned back to her. "So what happens now?" She had no answer. She had lived by certainty once, before Virelia's fall. She had known her place, her purpose. Then, when all of it had been reduced to dust, she had known only sorrow. Now, she was in uncharted space. And for the first time, that did not terrify her. She picked up a brush and dipped it into gold paint. Then, instead of touching the canvas, she reached out and lightly traced the tip against his palm. Eric blinked, watching as the shimmering pigment streaked his skin. "What's this?" "A promise," she said. "For what?" She met his gaze. "That I won't disappear again." Eric studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Because I wasn't planning on letting you." She smiled, small, but real. Then, turning back to the painting, she lifted the brush again. It was time to finish what she had started. Days passed, then weeks. Something unspoken settled between them. Not fragile, not uncertain, but waiting. Eric didn't push. He never did. Instead, he became part of her world as naturally as a new color blending into an old palette. He worked on his ships during the day, occasionally disappearing for piloting jobs that took him off-world. But he always came back. And at night, they explored the city. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation that drifted between the mundane and the profound. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, he said, "You ever think about leaving?" Elina glanced at him. "Leaving where?" "Earth. The station. This life." He gestured to the sky, where distant ships flickered like stars. "There's a whole galaxy out there. A lot of places you haven't seen." She considered this. For so long, she had felt like a wanderer without a home. The thought of traveling again, of stepping into the unknown, should have unsettled her. But instead, it intrigued her. "You want to leave?" she asked. Eric shrugged. "Not alone." She stopped walking. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I just mean, if you ever wanted to go, I'd go with you. No questions asked." Elina stared at him. She thought of the past, the loss, the grief. Then she thought of the way he had stayed, the way he had never asked for anything, yet had given her so much. She reached for his hand. "Maybe not yet," she said, "but one day." Eric smiled. "Then that's good enough for me." And as they stood beneath the city lights, The world around them faded, leaving only the space between them. A space that was no longer empty. The day came sooner than either of them expected. A transmission arrived, a message from the outer colonies. A newly discovered world, untouched, unexplored. The Terran fleet was seeking artists, scientists, historians, anyone who could help document the first settlement. Elina read the message twice. Then she turned to Eric. "You said you'd go if I did," she reminded him. Eric grinned. "You saying you want to?" She exhaled. I think I want to see what's out there." He nodded. "Then let's go find out." And just like that, the future stretched before them, vast and unwritten. Not an end, not a beginning, but a continuation. Together, the decision was made. Within a week, the preparations were in motion. Eric secured a ship, a sleek, mid-sized exploration vessel built for long journeys beyond the settled star systems. It wasn't the largest or the fastest, but it was reliable, and more importantly, it was theirs. Elina spent her days preparing, collecting supplies, deciding what to bring. The art studio had become a second home, but she could not take everything with her. Some pieces she stored, others she gave away. To the people who had come to watch her paint, to those who had become part of this chapter of her life. When the final day arrived, she stood in the empty studio, her fingers trailing over the canvas she had left behind. It was a painting of Earth, not as it was, but as she had seen it, as she had felt it. A world that had given her something unexpected, a beginning she had never anticipated. Eric appeared in the doorway. "You ready?" She turned, taking one last look at the space that had given her so much. Then she nodded. Yes. They walked side by side toward the waiting ship, and as the engines roared to life, Elina felt no fear, only possibility. The jump into deep space was smooth. Elina had been on many ships before, but none that felt quite like this. The vessel was not cold and impersonal like the rescue craft that had plucked her from the wreckage of Virilia. It was not vast and empty like Station Helios 4. This was different. It was theirs. Eric leaned back in the pilot's chair, hands moving over the controls with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the stars. Next stop, Colony Sector Epsilon 3. Should be about a week in hyperspace. Elina settled into the co-pilot seat, watching the swirling light of the hyperspace corridor stretch around them. A week. Plenty of time to get sick of me. She smirked. I passed that point months ago. He laughed. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. Then Eric spoke again, his voice quieter. You scared? Elina considered the question. Once, the unknown had terrified her. Losing Virilia had stripped her of everything certain, had left her drifting in a universe that no longer made sense. But now, as she sat beside Eric, watching the endless stretch of stars beyond the viewport, she realized she was not afraid. She was ready. No, she said. Eric turned to her, searching her face. Then he smiled. Good. And together, they watched the universe unfold before them. 7 days later, the ship dropped out of hyperspace. The colony world, designated Epsilon 3, but soon to be given a real name, loomed ahead, bathed in the golden light of a nearby star. It was untouched, a world of mountains that had never been climbed, forests that had never known the weight of footsteps. The first human settlers had only just begun to arrive, their outposts small and temporary. And now, it was her turn. Elina stepped to the viewport, her breath catching. It was beautiful. Not like Virilia, not like Earth, but something new. Eric leaned against the control panel beside her. Well, first impressions? She turned to him. I want to paint it. He grinned. Then let's go find you a good view. Moments later, the ship descended, and as they touched down on a world that had never known artists, never known the colors that would soon take shape under Elina's hands, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The colony settlement was little more than a scattering of temporary structures, prefabricated domes set against the vast, untouched wilderness. Scientists moved between them, their voices crackling over comms, their work focused on cataloging this world's ecosystem, its atmosphere, its potential. But Elina was not here to document numbers. She was here to see. The first morning on Epsilon 3, she climbed to the highest ridge near the settlement, carrying only her sketchbook. Eric followed, as he always did, hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the unbroken horizon. "You sure about this?" he asked. Elina knelt in the dirt, fingers tracing the texture of the earth. "Yes." Then she opened her book and began to draw. She had spent so long trapped in the past, using art as a way to remember. But now, for the first time, she painted something she had never seen before. New colors, new shapes, a world that had never been captured in pigment before this moment. Eric sat beside her, watching. "I don't think I've ever seen you work this fast." She glanced at him. "It's because this isn't memory. It's happening now." He smiled. "Yeah, it is." For a long time, they sat in silence, her sketching, him simply existing beside her. And as the twin suns of Epsilon 3 rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the untouched world, Elina realized something. She had not lost everything. She had found something. A new purpose, a new home, and a man who had shown her the way forward, not by pulling her from the wreckage, but by standing beside her as she learned to walk again. She turned to Eric, sunlight glinting in his eyes. "Stay with me," she said softly. He tilted his head. "I thought that was already obvious." She smiled. Then, dipping her fingers into the paint, she reached out and brushed a streak of gold across his cheek. "Hey," he laughed, wiping at it. Elina grinned. "You said you liked how you looked in color." He shook his head, still smiling. Then, without hesitation, he reached for the brush in her hand, dipped it in deep blue, and dragged a line across her nose. She gasped. "Eric." "Revenge," he said simply, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she laughed. Truly, freely, laughed. The wind swept around them, carrying the sounds of a new world. And as they sat together, painting each other in the colors of possibility, Elina knew. This was not just a new beginning. This was home.